For over a millennium, the domain between East and West, linking the Pacific with Europe through land and sea, served as the world's central nerve system. In The Silk Roads, A New History of the World, Peter Frankopan recalibrates our understanding of history and describes how the Silk Road network facilitated the movement of people, goods, ideas, conflicts, diseases, etc., and essentially drafted Western civilization as we know it. I'm your host Shirvan, and this is a review for the bookshelf. Being a professor of global history at Oxford University and the director of the Center for Byzantine Research, Peter Frankopan specializes in the history of the East. Frankopan was introduced to this field of study at an early age when he encountered the works of the Austrian anthropologist Eric Wolff, who challenged the long-established assumption that Western civilization is the heir to the Greco-Roman empires. Frankopan continues that line of work and has written extensively about the Mediterranean, the Caucasus, the Balkans, and the Middle East, as well as on the early history of Christianity and Islam. The Silk Roads by Frankopan is the latest addition to that Eastern perspective. Since the publishing of the ambitious book in 2015, over 1 million copies have been sold in the English edition, and it has since been translated in numerous languages including Korean, Chinese, Russian, Spanish, French, etc., making it a true global bestseller. In The Silk Roads, Frankopan places the origins of Western civilization in the Caucasus, Anatolia, Mesopotamia, Iran, and Central Asia, which collectively made up the core of ancient Persia. This is the area where empires were won and lost, where the most dramatic changes in the world took root. Of course, there is some recognition of the Americas and Australasia, but most of those regions get passing mention. That is not because the author finds it irrelevant, but because his book seeks to explain history through the prism of non-Eurocentric views. So the content largely remains confined to ancient Persia and recognizes it as the cradle of civilization. Now, this is nothing new, but through meticulous study and revealing details, the author takes that notion to a whole new level. In the span of some 520 pages, we learn about the first city-states in Mesopotamia and the formation of polytheistic and monotheistic religions. From there, Frankopan takes the reader on a journey across antiquity until arriving at the surge of cross-border commerce. With the entrance of the ancient Silk Road, the book picks up steam. The author reveals in fine detail how the ancient Silk Road encouraged not just the flow of merchandise, but also shows how those items promoted the exchange of philosophical thought, scientific advances, and much more. In our times of oversimplification and vilification of alternative beliefs, it is a breath of fresh air to read how in ancient times religions and ideas interacted, competed, and innovated, while its followers lived mostly in peace side by side, at least for a while. What's more is that Frankopan takes the effort to explain how academics analyze history and come to conclusions. For instance, the discovery of sunken vessels in the Red Sea and their cargo of ceramics illuminate the degree of commercial activity between the Roman Empire and the Indian kingdoms. Another example is how Alexander's campaign in the East brought Greek cultural practices to the Indus Valley, which inspired, among other things, the art of Buddhist sculptures. While most museums and history books barely mention such events, the Silk Roads uses such minute details to bring history to life, and it's easily the strongest component of the book. Yet we also learn that not everything that passed through the Silk Road was benign. Violence and disease traveled as frequently as commerce. The chapters on the Black Death, the Mongol conquests, and the Rus Viking expeditions are superbly written. I actually read those specific chapters a few times over because it was so compelling. In the ensuing chapters, the author writes about the ancient cities of the Abbasid Empire, whose names are mostly lost in mainstream history books. The author explains that while Europe was in turmoil, the Middle East was at the height of its wealth, power, and scientific achievement. As a result, kings, warriors, merchants, priests, and explorers along the Mediterranean were oriented towards the east, which expedited the rise and fall of empires and cultures. If you enjoyed our series on the science in Islam, The Silk Roads is in line with your taste. For most readers, the value of the book will be found in these chapters in the first half of the book. Once it reaches the 16th century with the discovery of the Americas and the European voyages to India, the narrative moves towards the west and chronicles the achievements of the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, British, and Americans. As these nations established great empires, the relationship between West and East gradually reversed. The mighty kingdoms in the East fell into retreat, and scientific and artistic cities such as Isfahan, Baghdad, Samarkand, Alexandria, and Timbuktu tumbled into ruin. This allowed the European powers to steadily colonize the Middle East and enforce their beliefs upon the region. At the same time, starting from the 19th century, there was a revival of secular and scientific traditions in the Middle East, but it was crushed by the colonial powers who had joined forces with the religious fundamentalists. From that moment onwards, the book takes a more sinister tone. As crude oil was discovered in Iraq, Arabia, Iran, etc., Western entities rushed to exploit these resources with minimum royalties to the nations where the resources were extracted. It is in these late chapters that we start to grasp the roots of the present resentment in the Middle East towards the West. Although these late chapters are valuable, they could have been shorter. And this is the most pressing flaw of The Silk Roads. The book has an imbalance of context. About half of the book covers a timeline extending from the 4th century BC to 1914. These chapters are insightful, fascinating, and present a rich summary of human history. But an equal number of pages in the second half of the book explains the events from only 1914 to 2017. This disproportionate focus was not necessary. I would have preferred to read more about ancient and medieval history than on the events of World War II and the Cold War. Still, considering the fact that the landscape stretching from China and India across Central Asia to Eastern Europe takes center stage in modern geopolitics, it is necessary to reassess world history. The Silk Roads does exactly that, which makes it an indispensable source of knowledge. Now, if you want to pick up this book, check out our link to our Amazon store in the description. Items that are purchased there will not cost you extra, but it will allow us to earn some fees and help to sustain our channel. I've been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Check out our bookshelf playlist for more recommendations on historical and political books. Also, special thanks to our top contributors on Patreon for enabling content like this. If you want to learn more about our crowdfunding, check out patreon.com/CaspianReport. In any case, thank you for your time, and Sahol.